Those who blundered into agriculture, whether north or south or east or west, found themselves trapped into systems that demanded control over nature and control over an ever-growing amount of people and their labor to try and keep nature under control. Those who avoided agriculture were able to focus on systems thinking that kept the weeds and pests under control for them, kept them under control for them. Nature did it. It wasn't at all the way our history books taught us. The absurd notion that agriculture was responsible for the creation of the cradle of civilization and our freedom from the elements. As Professor Hecht stressed in her classes at UCLA, this is just a just-so story that our culture teaches us to keep us on the treadmill. And there have been many peoples who've realized this and simply abandoned agriculture in favor of a lever lifestyle. For instance, around the time when many other tribes in Borneo, the world's largest island, were experimenting with rice growing introduced by Chinese traders, a couple of groups within the tribes called the Kenya weighed the options and decided it was a crappy life. Why, they asked themselves, would anybody work in the hot sun by the sweat of their brow, trying to plow the unforgiving earth just for a weak harvest of a little grain each year, with thistles and thorns following their efforts, as the Bible points out? It's the embodiment of the curse given to Adam and Eve in Genesis. So after practicing agriculture for a few generations, they said, screw it. And they let the land go wild and went into the rainforest and merged with the Panan people, becoming not primeval hunters and gatherers, but modern hunters and gatherers. In other words, they turned their back on agriculture and decided that hunting and gathering was actually more advanced. And so they remain to this day, fighting hard politically and with their lives to preserve their forest homeland, suffering repeated attempts at extermination by the agricultural communities and the multinationals who want to turn the entire island into oil palm plantations. I heard the same story from a regal Batak tribesman covered in tattoos with bone piercings in his face, whom I shared a bus ride with through the winding jungle roads of Sumatra one day. He turned to me and said in an accusing voice, "Anda Nasrani atau Muslim?" Indonesian for, "Are you Christian or Muslim?" "Christian," I replied meekly, wondering where this conversation was going to go. He thumped on his chest. "I am Christian," he said proudly. "Do you know why?" "I'd love to hear," I replied. All this was going on in Indonesian, by the way, and he was super pleased I could understand what he wanted to say. He smiled and asked, gesturing to the heavens, "What kind of God would forbid a man from eating babi hutan," the forest pig? "The Muslims came here and they said, 'No eating pig. It is forbidden. Instead, you must grow rice as we do. And my people said, 'This is miserable. It is hard labor in the hot sun and it doesn't taste good. And nobody can be strong eating rice.' And the Christian missionaries came and they said, 'God says you can eat babi hutan.' And we said, 'Thanks be to God, because we can eat babi hutan in the cool shade of the forest and it sustains us and it is delicious. This is why I am Christian.'" And I guess for many people, that's what really counts. Forest people in particular don't really understand why any God would curse us with suffering just to grow our food. And even the Christian forest people don't quite get Genesis, since they still live in an Eden. When I was working with missionaries in Borneo and stayed with the Christian Dayak tribes people of the forest, I was amazed to see that hunting and gathering really just involved gathering. An old witch doctor woman and her grandson took me into the forest to get the materials to prepare our celebration meal. And most of the day was spent with her slowly ambling down the cool forest trails with her walking stick and pointing at various plants and vines and flowers and fruit, at which point the little boy would scramble up a tree with delight, grab the ingredients, and drop back to the damp leaf-covered earth. As for the protein part of the meal, I was astonished to find that the hut we were celebrating in was built on stilts, and the bottom floor had an open corral that housed pigs and chickens who could wander in and out at their leisure. Above it, I noticed when I asked to use the bathroom, was a squat toilet. Our fecal material and whatever food scraps they had would be dropped through the hole and into the open corral below, where the animals rooted and pecked, turning our food and bodily wastes back into nutritious food that we were going to eat. Immediately corroborating what my professors had said, hunters in the forest didn't really hunt much, except for fun. Without gunfire scaring off the animals, all they had to do was create the right conditions, and the animals came to them. So much for the myth of a difficult life, nasty, brutish, and short, and the law of the jungle. National Geographic explorer-in-residence Wade Davis, who I'm proud to call a friend, wrote eloquently about the politics of the Penan hunter-gatherers, which is a Far East politics that is quite like that of the West and the South, indeed of almost all peoples who depend on the forest for survival. Quote, "In Sarawak, the wisdom of an entire people is waiting to be heard, numbering some 7,600, of whom perhaps 1,000 remain deep in the forest, following their ancient way of life. The Penan are one of the few truly nomadic rainforest societies of the earth. Related in spirit to the Mabutu pygmies of Zaire and the wandering Maku of the northwest Amazon, the Penan depended instead on wild populations of sago palm for their basic carbohydrate supply. The greatest transgression in Penan society is sihun, a term that translates roughly as a failure to share. Dependent on the forest for life and each other for survival, the Penan have in effect institutionalized individual generosity as a means of insulating the whole group as a whole from the inevitable uncertainties inherent in hunting and gathering ways of life. In Penan society, proper social behavior is learned by example rather than by rigorous discipline, and the importance of sharing is instilled in children from the earliest age. Young boys mastering the use of the blowpipe, for example, are encouraged to carefully divide the cooked meat from the smallest of prey, allotting equal portions to all the other children. In one instance, a young Penan youth who had gone hungry for several days killed a tele, the world's smallest squirrel, which he cooked and consumed alone. His failure to share provoked not anger, but laughter on the part of the adults. They simply bestowed on the boy the name Tele, so that he would never forget his transgression. For all Dayak peoples of Borneo, the concept of private ownership of land did not exist. In the agricultural societies, customary law dictated that the community as a whole controlled the resource base. Individual proprietary rights were automatically granted to those who worked the land, provided they fulfilled the incumbent ritual and ecological obligations. This principle of land stewardship is enshrined in the traditional law, or adat, a concept that has moral, legal, and religious implications. The subversion of this philosophy, the imposition of a foreign notion of land tenure, and the wresting of control of the land from the indigenous peoples are three dominant themes that have molded Sarawak history since the time of the British. The Penan believe that the rainforest and its bounty were given to them by the Creator, the god Balain Nge Butun. Their biological adaptation, together with their spiritual beliefs, demands that they exploit the forest in a sustainable manner. Central to their worldview is a sacred obligation to bequeath to the following generations a healthy forest fully capable of providing life to its human inhabitants. As a Penan elder explains, the land is sacred. It belongs to the countless numbers who are dead, the few who are living, and the multitudes of those yet to be born. How can the government say that all untitled land belongs to itself when there had been people using the land even before the government itself existed?" End quote. As we mentioned in the last lecture, without being naive about human nature or harping on the noble savage stereotypes, drawdown solution number 39, indigenous peoples' land management, is crucial for our survival, because only they have the cultural wisdom gleaned from millennia of trial and error to keep the land productive, because they didn't descend from collapsed civilizations, or if they did, they learned their lesson and applied it and now occupy the only remaining intact ecosystems on the planet. Only their wisdom can help us preserve the tropical forests, the last refuges of biodiversity on the planet, which comes in at number 5 of the 100 drawdown solutions, reducing CO2 by 61.23 gigatons, with global costs and savings data too variable to be determined. Only with their help can we preserve and wisely use the coastal wetlands, which can store, quote, 5 times as much carbon as tropical forests over the long term, mostly in deep wetland soils, end quote. Soils that our culture is always dredging. Coastal wetlands comes in at number 52 among our solutions, reducing 3.19 tons of CO2, but protecting 53.34 gigatons of stored carbon with no real way to determine the cost. Our book says, quote, the soil of mangrove forests alone may hold the equivalent of more than 2 years of global emissions, 22 billion tons of carbon, much of which would escape if these ecosystems were lost, end quote. But these unsung carbon sinks have been relentlessly destroyed in the cowboy economy. Our book reminds us, quote, often in human history, wetland has meant wasteland, a place to dike, dredge, and drain for purposes ranging from farming to homesteading. These coastal ecosystems have suffered from mosquito spraying, pollution and sediment runoff, timber extraction, invasive species, and operations of the fossil fuel industry. They've been cleared to make way for shrimp farms, palm plantations, condo developments, and golf courses. Over the past few decades, more than 1/3 of the world's mangroves have been lost, end quote. Now here in Florida, most of it was due to conversion to cow pasture, which was patently stupid from an economic perspective because, as they point out when you're standing on the wooden pier walkway over the swamp at Gatorland in Orlando, munching on delicious gator steaks, alligators, being cold-blooded, are much more efficient at converting what they catch in the swamp into reptile beef than cows per unit of land. And that doesn't even include the fish and the frogs, the nutria and other mammals and reptiles and amphibians and cattails that we can harvest from the wetland. And yet, the Seminole Indians of Florida were able to survive and thrive quite well in those swamps when fighting back against the invaders for generations. As you will learn from the Tampa Bay History Center, which I highly encourage you to visit, they were among the last to give up until finally forced to march on the Trail of Tears, because the coastal wetland swamp forests of Tampa Bay were so rich and comfortable. They were able to take what they needed and leave enough for those who came after, consistently for thousands of years, until politics forced them out. So much for the law of the jungle being red in tooth and claw, or nasty, brutish, and short. So the real question for us as Americans in October of 2020, when this is being recorded, isn't whether you favor a government that is Republican or Democrat or capitalist or socialist or communist or fascist or feudal, or any of those modern manifestations of essentially similar agrarian societies based on exploitation and extraction. The real political issue is whether you want to be a taker or a leaver. Which one are you?